شم و خواهم بود دور از دیار نخواهم شد تا گفت هست میان دارم اهل کنار نخواهم شد.
I would like to welcome you all and offer a special welcome to Simin Behbahani's brother, who has kindly arrived here, Mr. Auditorium, and to all our invited guests who have come from far places and some from near here to celebrate a truly remarkable woman. It is difficult not to sound hyperbolic when you talk about Simin Behbahani. Milan Kundera, the great novelist, writes that artists are usually lesser than their work. It is, he says, best not to meet the artists you idolize, as they will never fail to disappoint you. Simin Behbahani was that rare exception, a woman at least as great and gracious, as humble, and at the same time as defiant as her art. I witnessed one of the most remarkable examples of the power of words when she first visited Stanford 12 years ago. The first year I was here at Stanford, we had a conference and we invited Simin Behbahani amongst several others. She read a piece that my sister and I have translated. It will appear in a book in February. She read it in Persian, and there was a large audience. Amongst the audience was one of our colleagues at Stanford, one-time Secretary of State, one-time Secretary of the Treasury, George Shultz. At the end of her talk, he walked up to her and said, I didn't understand a single word of what you said because I don't speak Persian. But there was such power and such grace in your words that I wept. The fact that someone can be so moved by the power of her presence and this searing honesty that she exemplified is to me the best testimony of the kind of a person that she was. In trying to remember her passing, we thought that the best way to do it would be to try to have a discussion about some aspects of her work. We had invited her daughter, who appeared on our program, to come and talk about what she had suggested would be the mythical themes in her poetry, in her mother's poetry. Till a few days ago, she was all set to come, though she is now a visiting lecturer in Australia. In the last minute, her employer, a research center in Iran, banned her from coming to Stanford. So we are very sorry that she's not going to be here. She kindly sent her paper and suggested that we could read it, but I thought, and I consulted with my sister Farzaneh, and we decided that it would be defeating the purpose to read a paper without her being here. So I'm very sorry that she's not going to be here. I will discuss it with her. If she wants, we can put the paper on our website. Before I introduce our speakers tonight, I want to thank our very capable program manager, Pasang Sherpa, who has singularly successfully managed some of the very complicated events we have done in the last month. I'm going to briefly introduce the 4 speakers, and it doesn't appear on the program, but we have one addition to the program. I'll talk a little bit about that after I briefly introduce the speakers. Our first speaker will be Farzaneh Milani, who I have the great privilege and pleasure of being her brother, or she being my mentor, my teacher, my protector, my better angel, she being the first person to really teach me the most important lesson of my life, that women are smarter than men. Farzaneh Milani has arguably done more than anyone to introduce Iranian women writers and artists to the English-speaking world. Suffice it to say that she has published or edited pioneering works on Qurratul Ain, Furuq Farrokhzad, Simin Daneshvar, and Simin Behbahani. She has generously given up her time and wisdom in planning tonight's event. Every aspect of this event, if it is good, it is her work. If it is late and faulty, it is my fault. Kaveh, Safa, who will speak after Farzaneh, and with Farzaneh they have together translated Simin Behbahani's work, A Cup of Sin, is a scholar of endless erudition, a poet in his soul, a scholar in his mind with an endless wandering desire in his heart. I have had the good fortune of knowing him for over 20 years. He never ceases to surprise me. His erudition, his humility, his endless curiosity is truly remarkable. Every time I see him, I blame myself for not having the chance to spend more time with him. I am truly not speaking hyperbolically. He is a remarkable scholar and poet. Miss Mary Ostby is of a new generation of young scholars whose love of Persian culture and letters is matched only by their impressive mastery of Western canon. Her paper is inspired by a multidisciplinary comparative analysis of icons of Iranian woman literature that she is doing at the University of Virginia. A few words about the other segment. Simin Behbahani was more than anything a lover of Persian words and of poetry. It is thus only befitting that the concluding part of our presentations will be a poem written in memory of Simin by Professor Bahram Beyzaie, whose lyrical prose has made him the country's paramount playwright, but who is also a poet of remarkable verve and versatility. The music of the words about Simin and the enduring power of her poetry compared to the transient yet destructive legacy of bullies and champions of censorship need no translation. Like Simin's first presentation at Stanford, the poignancy and presence of the words and of the poet, Bahram Beyzaie, are in themselves sufficient.
I feel honored to be here this afternoon to pay tribute to Simin Behbahani, Iran's beloved national poet, and my treasured surrogate mother. I am at a loss for words to fully convey the impact she had on my life and will continue to have on my life. I'm also thankful to the organizer of this event, my brother Abbas Milani, for granting me the privilege to be here in the presence of such a distinguished audience and in the company of such great speakers. Like my brother said, Ms. Pashang is an absolute treasure for Iranian studies at Stanford. She's impeccable, so I'm most grateful to her too. I met Simin Behbahani for the first time in the early 1980s through Simin Daneshvar, a mutual friend. Baffled that not a single book at the time was devoted in its entirety to the analysis of her work, I was preparing a special issue of the journal Nimeh Digar to be devoted in its entirety to the celebration of her unique contribution to Persian literature. I wanted to interview her, but wasn't sure she would consent. She was an eminent poet, an established one in Iran, and I, an unknown and young academician in the US. Regardless, with her customary generosity of spirit and humility, with boundless grace and dignity, she welcomed me and my project with open arms. From that first auspicious meeting to the enduring, enchanting relationship that followed, to our last week-long get-together in Hungary 2 years ago, Behbahani consistently fascinated me with her effortless kindness and warmth, with her sense of humor and candor, with the elasticity of her mind. Over the years, I came to increasingly respect the synthesis of old and new, East and West, feminine and masculine, tradition and modernity in her work, but also in the fabric of her personality. I was awed by her belief in the power of words, by her conviction that art and compassion, quiet generosity and brave empathy can accomplish miracles. I respected how she managed to be factual without being sensational, being political but not partisan, candid but not judgmental. Most importantly, I admired her sense of obligation to create a better world through peaceful means. Behbahani led me, like Alice, to the wonderland of her poetry. She opened the gates of my life to a world of paradoxes and disrupted certainties. She directed me to a universe in which absolutism had no place, a space in which opposites were allowed to live in perfect harmony. Like many of you, I have been mesmerized by the versatility and sublime beauty of her ghazals. In them, we watched the gently flowing water and the pounding waves. We have been caressed by rainbows and the traveling breeze. We have enjoyed breathtakingly beautiful sunrises and sunsets. We have found ourselves summoned to a place of unhurried reflection and joyous communion. At the same time, her poems have portrayed the heart of darkness and the depth of human depravity. In them, we have witnessed the ravages of war, of prejudice and gender inequity, of corruption and complacency, of segregation and sexual abuse, of physical violence and greed. We have seen prisons, mass graves, and merciless vigilantes springing up like weeds after the rain. We have seen politicians turned into cannibals and mothers giving birth to snakes. We have witnessed a maimed soldier returning from the front, a man whipped in the public square, a woman stoned to death. We have seen a mother gone mad with the loss of her soldier son. We have watched in horror the execution of perfectly innocent children by firing squads. But no matter how oppressive the reality, no matter how unjust the circumstances. Optimism kept shining through her poetry. The magical spell of her audacious hope has lifted our hearts and consoled our soul. So alongside the madness she described with precision, she also depicted grace, gentility, and compassion. She portrayed reverence for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. She illustrated how despair and hope, vulnerability and strength, harsh suffering and intense fellowship can coexist. In the wonderland of her poetry, she demonstrated how monsters and slayers of monsters can live side by side in the same country. Small wonder then, in a country where poetry is the national scripture, she has earned herself the status of an icon. Indeed, in more than 1,000 years of Iranian literature, it is unprecedented for a woman to have reached this level of national and international recognition during her lifetime. Behbahani is also the most prolific Iranian female poet. While the poems of many of our unsung female poets are buried in oblivion and neglect, whereas only about 50 poems have survived from Tahireh Qurratul Ain, 210 poems from Parveen Ehtesami, 130 poems from Furugh Farrokhzad, Behbahani has published more than 600 poems. She was a prodigy who published her first poem when she was only 14. And for over 7 decades, she never relinquished her truth-seeking, truth-telling pen. And there is a lot to be said about longevity among Iranian women poets. Tahireh Qurratul Ain was executed at the age of 36. Parveen Ehtesami died of a mysterious typhoid fever when she was 34. And Furugh Farrokhzad died in a car accident when she was only 32. It's the good fortune of us, her loyal readers, that Behbahani lived to be 87. True to her motto, to stay alive, you must slay silence, Behbahani was a voice of dissent, a fierce defender of human rights and human dignity in pre- and post-revolutionary Iran. She spoke out regardless of consequences, and there were many consequences, from the monetary to the political, from street harassment to court summons, from anonymous slander to official denunciation, from censure and confiscation of passport to country arrest. But she continued to reject the urge for revenge or advocating violence. And in the process, she chronicled the Iranian people's struggle for democracy and justice. I believe her poetry is one of the most accurate history written about post-revolutionary Iran from the street level up. It's the history of the Iranian people. شمشیر من همین شعر است، پرکارتر ز هر شمشیر. با این سلاح شیرین کار خون ریختن نمیخواهم. جز حق نمیتوانم گفت. گر سر بریدنم باید، سر پیش می نهم و از مرگ بگریختن نمیخواهم. My poems are my sword. They are mightier than any sword. Though they can cut deep, my weapon is not for bloodshed. I will tell nothing but the truth, even if it cost my head. Fear of death will not stop me from marching on. Behbahani has often been celebrated for revolutionizing the ghazal, a traditional poetic form with deep roots in Persian literature. And indeed, she did change ghazal's age-old patterns that were gendered. She developed a language and a style all her own. But Behbahani was more than a master of ghazals. She also tried her hand at prose and created a groundbreaking genre in her last book, which is dedicated to her personal life and to the life of her mother. با مادرم همراه زندگی نامه خود نوشت. The title of the book is a culminating tour de force in a glorious literary career. Like the rainbow, when sunshine and rain come together, like the break of dawn, what in Persian we call gorgomish, when light and darkness are seen at the same time. Like the opening phrase of Persian stories, Yeki bud, yeki nabud. There was one and there wasn't one. When the created becomes one and the same with the creator. Like lovemaking, when the walls of separation between self and other melt away, and from the fusing of the two, heaven is created on earth. A journey with my mother is a masterpiece. It is Behbahani's swan song. The book defies cliché and categorization. It's a mosaic narrative which blurs generic boundaries and split identities. It's a hybrid text at the intersection of biography and autobiography, veiled history and unveiled lives, eulogy, and the recovery of a suppressed but important part of women's movement in Iran. It is the celebration of a biological mother and a literary foremother. It's the life of a daughter seamlessly woven into the life of a mother. Behbahani's mother, Fakhr Uzma Arqun, was, according to her daughter, one of the wonders of her day. Indeed, she was. In an era in which reading and writing were considered sinful for women, she benefited from her father's progressive and courageous insistence that she be educated alongside her two brothers. She studied Persian literature, Islamic jurisprudence, Arabic language, astronomy, philosophy, logic, history, and geography, under the tutelage of some of the most recognized masters of her time. From childhood, she studied French with a Swiss governess. She wrote poetry and short stories. She translated from French into Persian. She played the tar. She was one of the founding members of the Association of Patriotic Women and an active member of Women's Society of Iran. Both of these were leading groups during the early part of the 20th century. 80 years ago, in 1935, she founded a journal named Women's Letter. Argun's impressive profile is matched by a fascinating life. She was a very young girl when she submitted a patriotic poem for publication in a newspaper, Eqdam. Abbas Khalili, the founder and editor of the newspaper, who was also a poet and a novelist in his own right, was so moved by the poem that he found the young poet and asked her hand in marriage. This is such a beautiful story that could only happen probably in Iran, when a man falls in love with a woman unseen just because of her poetry. But this poetic union didn't last long. In fact, it was quite short-lived. The couple's first and only child, Simin, which was originally named Simin Behbahani, was born in 1927, but by that time, the couple were already divorced. The first time Mr. Khalili will see his daughter, Simin Behbahani, she would be already 2 years old. So it was under the loving care of such a pioneering mother that Behbahani grew up, and she never tired of acknowledging her debt to her mother. In an interview, she said, "My mother taught me honesty, integrity, intense feelings, and poetry. She encouraged me to learn classical Persian music, which she considered an indispensable tool for an Iranian poet. From early childhood, it was my mother who encouraged me to follow in her footsteps as a poet and as a writer. It was she who put poetry on my lips, one word at a time." One could say that Simin Behbahani becomes the missing link in Persian literature, the absent daughter previously, who recognizes not only her mother's love, but also her vital contribution to her career. She's also, to the best of my knowledge, the only daughter eulogist who mourns in print the passing of her mother. You might remember Parveen Ehtesami's beautiful poem, her most personal poem, was written about her father. In a poem entitled "I Cannot Forget You," published in her 5th poetry collection, Rastakhi's Resurrection, Behbahani combines tribute and gratitude, longing and loss, and identifies her mother as the generating power behind her poetry. سخن دیگر نگفتی ای سخن پرداز خاموشم. فراموشت نمی کردم. چرا کردی فراموشم؟ ز سردی های خاک تیره آغوشت چه می جوید؟ چه بد دیدی؟ چه بد دیدی ز گرمی های آغوشم؟ نه چشم بسته بگشایی، نه راه رفته بازایی، به مرگت بار تنهایی چه سنگین است بر دوشم. تو آگه کردی از لفظم، تو ساغر دادی از شعرم. به دلخواه تو میگویم، به فرمان تو می نوشم. Forget you I cannot. Why then have you forgotten me? Why have you stopped speaking, O you, my silent orator? What were you seeking? What were you seeking in the bosom of a dark grave? Oh, what was wrong? Pray tell me, what was wrong with my warm, loving bosom? How is it that you do not open your closed eyes? How is it that you do not return from the road taken? In your absence, lonesomeness weighs heavily on my shoulder. You are the one who gave me words. You are the one who filled my cup with poems. If I write, it's to please you. If I'm intoxicated, it is as you command. Motherhood has been extolled and glorified in Persian literature. It has been put on a pedestal and adulated. It has been presented for the most part as a woman's sole calling and her ultimate fulfillment in life. In spite of its sanctification, however, maternity rarely has been studied or represented by or from the perspective of women. Female writers and poets, especially Simin Behbahani and Forough Farrokhzad, have humanized motherhood. They have rejected tyrannical demands of motherly perfection or the ideology that posits motherhood is incompatible with work beyond the domestic sphere. They have rechanneled the focus from the unconditional, self-sacrificing love of mothers for their children, in particular their sons, to motherhood as experience and institution. They have refused to see a woman's contribution to society only in childbearing and child-rearing. In her last book, Behbahani resists the narrow definition of motherhood. She rejects the singleness of commitment and the selflessness expected of mothers, these eternal givers. She expands the boundaries of family alternatives and argues that without an egalitarian family, where gender equity and mutual respect govern, where mothers are allowed to develop their full potentials, enduring democracy and genuine advancement of social justice is impossible. And indeed, tyranny at home prepares the grounds for accepting and perpetuating political tyranny. Behbahani integrates mothers and daughters in this book and offers a depolarized definition of femininity. She does not hold her mother captive of a restrictive image of motherhood. To the contrary, she rejoices in and sings her praises and for her many accomplishments. Her accomplishment as a poet, as an activist, and of course, as a loving mother. She also mourns the loss of her mother, which is always a double loss for any daughter. It's the loss of the mother, and it's the loss of the daughter in every daughter that loses a mother. A book of autobiography ends with 25 of Fakhr Uzma Argun's poetry. The message seems to be clear. Death is unavoidable, inescapable. It is cruel in its finality and final in its cruelty. It's a law of nature, but it is the most democratic of all institutions. It's an equal opportunity provider. In a sense, death is a journey we all begin upon our birth. What matters, though, Behbahani seems to tell us, is the legacy left behind. And what a unique legacy and rich legacy Simin Behbahani has left behind. A singular reputation, precious memories, and a voluminous body of work. 19 poetry collections, 2 memoirs, an autobiography, 2 short story collections, numerous literary articles, essays, and interviews, a book of translation from French poetry into Persian, and over 300 lyrics for some of Iran's most prominent singers. This is surely an outstanding record, especially in view of the fact that for 29 years, Behbahani was also a high school teacher of Persian literature and the loving mother of 1 daughter and 2 sons, Omid, Ali, and Hussein, 7 grandchildren, one of whom, Arjan, she lost to cancer, and 3 great-grandchildren. To our chagrin, Simin Behbahani's 87-year journey has ended. But another, no less phenomenal journey has already begun. Yes, my friends, Simin Behbahani's passing has left a void in our hearts and in our midst. But her voice is undying. It is eternal. So farewell, Khanum Behbahani Aziz, wherever you are in your journey now. May your elegant and peace-loving voice continue to inspire your family, friends, and eager readers. May your words, mightier than swords, be spread throughout the world. May your cherished memories console your countless fans and those who, like me, have had the good fortune to know you and to treasure you. So long, dear friend. So long, dear mother.
She was thinking about death and the meaning of life and death, and she made explicit her thoughts about these things. So one of them is called, I've borrowed Kerouac's loose translation, On the Road. It has to do with the road. The months and the years have aged me, not the infidelity of friends. Life moves on, I grow old, bitterly, isn't it so? You grow old? How fortunate, quickly reaching your destination. For us, there can be no other outcome. Beyond this, no other adventure. What? Death a destination? We've come here to die? Isn't that stupid? Our births and deaths are 2 points at the 2 ends of a line. The length of which constitutes all our existence. Nothing at the beginning, nothing at the end, and all in between. And between these points, we must walk without control or reason. But no, I remember not making any such promise. One can break the line, one can protest with these words, saying no. If we were born without choice, we can choose our death. We can choose poison, electrocution, slitting our veins, or hanging, can't we? No, consider the line, its whole extension. It's a rough road strewn with rocks, which only your footsteps can make smoother. Once you embark on this road, you leave behind many traces. Death will not take you. Death will not take you. But the callous and the benighted. Should you abandon the road or surrender, whoever seeks any sign of your existence will hear from the passerby who followed you, nothing, who? The other poem I'd like to read you is My Songs, and I hope she will forgive me for my liberties I've taken. I could not resist the temptation reading this poem that she wasn't thinking of Hamlet. And it's an awkward translation, but my songs, not to be, you want me, I will be. Not to be, you want me, but I will be. From this land, I won't be divided. While there's an arena still, I will not be at the sidelines. I have meadows full of songs and poems. Breathing this air has nourished my being. I am the gazelle's swift gazelle. I will not be easily hunted. Speaking out has been my creed, but no stones or hardship daunted. I am the untamable flood. I cannot be harnessed. Why should I hide my hair in deceit? Why should I be another Gorda Farid? I am the kind of woman who wouldn't use unmanly guile to seek safety behind fortress walls. I am the lightning bolt, unadorned by silence. Thunder's uproar follows my flash of radiance. From my labors I will not be distracted. The arrow that has wounded my eyes has failed its lethal purpose. Don't place me on a saddle. My head will not be like Esfandiar's. That is slumping. I believe, come what may, as outrage or as cries, only the voice remains. And I have not long to go. Yet in my old age and infirmity, I hold on to my horse's mane. I am ready to go, but I understand I will never ride again. So only the voice remains. Speaking about Kafka, Khomeini and certain events in Iran could have been scripted by Kafka. One of those has to do with music, and only the voice remains. Well, in 1979, Ayatollah Khomeini decided to abolish music, all music, and also with basically a few words, he abolished women singing in public. How you could do that just with a few words, this you find in Kafka's stories. It's fantastic, but it was real. And of course, there were lots of things that made it possible. What is interesting with this is the sea of ice gathers, but it's not a gradual coming over your head. It is like phase change. It's like water turning to ice all of a sudden. What is really interesting in this is, again, like a Kafka story, is how can you banish music? It's just part of our being. And in the years that followed, what is truly interesting is the ingenuity of many Iranians in terms of getting music to leak back into life. The leakage starts very early. For example, when Ayatollah Montazeri dies, then Ayatollah Khomeini himself says eulogies are fine. And also, basically, he said, patriotic songs and music are fine.
Tonight we're here to celebrate the inspiring life and the groundbreaking work of a beloved and distinguished poet and activist, icon and iconoclast, Simin Behbahani, the lioness of Iran. I'm honored to be here standing on the shoulders of giants. First and foremost, of course, the incomparable Kaveh Behbahani, and such authoritative figures as Bahram Beyzaie, Kaveh Safa, and my mentor, Farzaneh Milani, for whom no words can ever convey my gratitude and my love. And I want to sincerely thank Dr. Abbas Milani and the program in Iranian Studies for inviting me. And thank you, a huge and sincere thank you to Pasang Sherpa for all of your help. Personally, I encountered the work of Simin Behbahani, traveling down a different academic road than many of the distinguished Iranian studies scholars who are here today. I'm a literary comparatist, working from within an English department, but I've spent several years researching the global impact of a few key Iranian women authors in the contemporary period. Among this group, the words of Simin Behbahani have for years captivated me in a completely unique way. In the rhythm of her poems, in both Persian and English, I think, you can hear both the beating heart of a nation and a pulse that resonates across the world. Her words somehow manage to remain both extremely local, true to the specific joy, pain, and hope of the Iranian people, and profoundly global, eminently translatable, and inspiring to a host of other poets who have used the ghazal as a transnational poetic form of protest for social justice. Today, I'd like to argue that the ethics of cross-cultural solidarity in Behbahani's poetry has a great deal to do with her early embrace and significant development of the ghazal as a particular poetic form. I'll compare her renovation of the ghazal in Persian to that of the iconic American feminist poet Adrienne Rich in English. Rich and Behbahani had similar lifespans. They were born 2 years apart in 1927 and 29, and passed away 2 years apart in 2012 and 2014. In their long lives and their prolific careers, both started publishing remarkably young and wrote all their lives, their poetry evolving with the decades. both witnessed historic revolutions, both lived through terrible wars, and both were deeply involved in political protest. Both wrote poignantly about living as a woman, a mother, and a daughter in patriarchal societies that they often found oppressive. Both were national literary matriarchs who dug deep into the social and cultural fabric of Iran and the United States, respectively, telling both love stories and hard truths about their respective countries. But beyond that, they grappled bravely, in poetry and prose alike, with what it means to be a responsible global citizen in the modern world. So there are many striking parallels between Rich and Khanim Behbahani, not least of which is their mutual love of the ghazal, an ancient poetic form that has often been called difficult, archaic, and inaccessible. The prehistory of the ghazal can be traced back to the Arabian Peninsula in the 5th century. From Arabic, it followed 3 major linguistic and literary branches of development, 1 towards the Urdu literary world, 2 towards Persian and eventually Turkish, and 3 towards German and eventually Russian. With the gradual opening of rhyme, meter, and theme in ghazals of all languages over the course of the 20th century, the question of which formal restrictions should and shouldn't be strictly enforced in modern ghazals in order to qualify as real ghazals has received some attention in the past couple of decades. The Kashmiri American poet Agha Shahid Ali insisted that in any language, only those ghazals which adhere to certain formal restrictions can be considered real adaptations of the form. To him, each couplet in a ghazal must be, quote, autonomous, thematically and emotionally complete in itself. One should at any time, he says, be able to pluck a couplet like a stone from a necklace, and it should continue to shine in that vivid isolation, though it would have a different luster with and among the other stones. The ghazal, he argues, is driven by this total self-containment of couplets. The opening couplet of a ghazal sets up a rhyme scheme by establishing a radif, or a refrain that occurs in both lines of the first couplet and then only in the second line of each subsequent couplet. Ali describes the ghazal poet as a slave to that rhyme scheme, which becomes master of the poem once it is established. So a key difference between the ghazals of Simin Behbahani and Adrian Rich is that Rich largely dispensed with that end rhyme of the radif altogether. Behbahani, for the most part, retained it, but this does not make any of her poems speakers enslaved to the form by any means. Anyone vaguely familiar with either poet knows that these women were not interested in being tethered to convention. Instead, they made it their mission to quote the title of one of Rich's most famous poems, dive into the wreck of literary history and breathe new life into the materials at hand. To find the beauty in antiquated forms and to democratize them for a contemporary truth-seeking audience. In modern Persian literature, Simin Behbahani is famous for transporting the ghazal to Zaban-e-Ruz, the language of today, which she cited as the main achievement of her career. She was the first Iranian poet to integrate modern political and social concerns and informal conversation into the ghazal. Many of her ghazals make minimalistic use of radif, and while her couplets include self-contained images, they're also often interrelated in both syntax and theme, weaving couplets into a poem's larger narrative, setting, or mood. In telling stories through the ghazal, Behbahani forged a political opening of the poetic form in Persian, not only making it accessible for contemporary Iranian readers, but also infusing it with vivid imagery that translates well outside the rhyme scheme, extending the 20th century Persian ghazal into the field of world literature. Behbahani imbued this ancient form with modern stories, stories of state violence and censorship, stories of social justice rebuilding a nation, stories of women transgressing social norms. She was a powerful force in the public sphere of Iran, and her poetry provided a beacon of hope for many activists at troubling points in Iran's history. Widely revered as the country's poet laureate, she wore her patriotism on her sleeve in her poetry and her life. Despite being subject to interrogations, long periods of country arrest, even into her mid-80s as she suffered health problems, she vehemently refused to leave Iran, for the safety and comforts of life in the literary diaspora, insisting that poets must take part in the movement for change from within. One of her best-loved poems, often recited during protests in Iran and set to music, is the patriotically titled ghazal, Dobare misazamet vatan, My country, I will build you again. The poem opens by fusing corporeal and architectural imagery in an extended metaphor that implies a deep structural unity between person and nation. And I'll only read the first two couplets, in Persian first, and then the English translation by Farzaneh and Kaveh. دوباره میسازمت وطن اگرچه با خشت جان خویش ستون به سقف تو میزنم اگرچه با استخوان خویش. My country, I will build you again, if need be with bricks made from my life. I will build columns to support your roof, if need be with my bones. The radif Behbahani chooses for this ghazal is utterly minimalistic. The end rhyme khish merely means self, and it's used in possessive constructions to mean both my, your, and his. And in this way, the end rhyme does not circle the poem back upon its speaker, or any single repeated subject or theme. Instead, it unifies disparate voices, using one consistent grammatical construction. Later on in the poem, Behbahani evokes the phrase hadith of love of country. And by using the transnationally charged word vatan, she references a series of complex questions about identity categories, belonging, and contingency. It doesn't mean nation in the sense of blind allegiance to the current powers that be in government or religious authority or elsewhere. It means rootedness in a more durable, more profound allegiance to your history. It means finding identity by way of trust in your chosen community. In the nationalism of this famous ghazal, Behbahani is also reversing the gender dynamics of the ghazal's convention as a love poem, usually centered on the figure of the beloved. In this ghazal, it is the vatan that becomes the beloved. Here, the definition of vatan grows broader than geospatial, historical, ethno-linguistic, or religious boundaries. It is ultimately the notion of justice that becomes the figure of the beloved, and various metaphors and expressions in Behbahani's ghazals. Behbahani's American counterpoint, Adrienne Rich, in her ghazals written in English around the time of the Vietnam War, echoes the simultaneous concentration and expansiveness of the ghazal form. The ghazal is not a one-time exploration for Rich. It's a form to which she devotes two lengthy sequences in two of her most groundbreaking volumes in 1969 and 1971, and which she revisits much later in her career. Initially, the ghazal form became Rich's way to formally articulate the struggle for cooperation between marginalized communities, in a way that the images and allusions of her poetry could not fully capture in such a moment of radical political fragmentation among the young American left, not unlike the disparate, dissident voices that characterized the '79 revolution in Iran. '68 was a time of infinite potential for artists and activists to collaborate and unite in their political efforts against the Vietnam War. Rich was living in New York City, an epicenter of protest in the world historical moment of 1968. Although Vietnam was a moment of national crisis for America, '68 was also a global moment of insurrection. Its spirit of upheaval tied together disparate events from student riots in Paris to ongoing decolonization across Africa. Where Behbahani's radifs, or end rhymes, are often minimalistic, Rich's ghazals usually dispense with the radif altogether. And this makes already separate couplets read as even more fragmentary and isolated, focused in on the speaker. But since Rich also eliminates the taqalos, or invocation of the speaker's name, in the final couplet, this effect is counterbalanced, along with her frequent use of dedication and intertextuality, by a concluding tone that marks the form as a borrowed thing or a shared resource. These two renovations pull Rich's ghazals in two simultaneous directions, towards the intimate and towards the international. And these two directions may seem contradictory, but the combination makes for a balanced treatment of the war poem, a lyric that is vivid and immediate, but without biographical interference by the speaker or the poet. So the first ghazal in her first series reads, "The clouds are electric in this university. The lovers astride the tractor burn fissures through the hay. When I look at that wall, I shall think of you and of what you did not paint there. Only the truth makes the pain of lifting a hand worthwhile. the prisons staggering under the blows of the raga. The vanishing point is the point where he appears. Two parallel tracks converge, yet there has been no wreck. To mutilate privacy with a single foolish syllable is to throw away the search for the one necessary word. When you read these lines, think of me and of what I have not written here. The beginning of the poem pulls the reader outward with its panorama of clouds and a landscape from which one would have to zoom out to see the burnt fissures made by the tractor's momentary ride. The first line, "The clouds are electric in this university," is a quotation by the young son of painter Sheila Rotner, to whom the poem is dedicated. Apparently, the boy meant to say universe instead of university. The poem seizes upon this easy slippage between the local and the global to explore a more profound convergence, I think, between personal and public speech. The poem suggests a self-aware commentary on the poet's disobedience of the Radif Convention, since the repetition of a, quote, single foolish syllable would be too restrictive for the project of finding the necessary word to end each couplet. She says it would be a violation of, quote, privacy for the victims of war, whose stories deserve to be separately named and individually documented, like the couplets. But there is still a large-scale end rhyme and a larger symmetry between the lines "what you did not paint there" and "what I have not written here," which together form a meditation on inaction on the part of both speaker and object. In place of a taqalos, the pairing of you and me in that final couplet, think of me, when you read these lines, think of me and of what I have not written here, forges a meaning-making collaboration between poet and reader, rather than the self-referential signature effect of the usual convention. One might say, in fact, that this implicit dialogue is Rich's signature, as she reaches into a community, a global community of other poets, activists, and readers, to acknowledge that her own experiences of the war and the world is necessarily limited, curtailed, open-ended, and ever-searching. Similarly, Behbahani often employed transnationally accessible imagery, even when describing the particular political climate of Iran. Here is one such poem, an early poem, Donyaye Kochakiman, My Small World, which addresses a pre-revolutionary moment in which censorship and persecution under the Shah had grown into a pervasive climate of terror. Again, I'll read it in Persian first, and then the English translation by Milani and Safa. وقتی که سیم حکم کند زر خدا شود وقتی دروغ داور هر ماجرا شود وقتی هوای تنفس هوای زیست سر پوش مرگ بر سر صدها صدا شود وقتی در انتظار یکی پار استخوان هنگامه‌ای ز جنبش دمها به پا شود وقتی به بوی سفره همسایه مغز و عقل بی اختیار معده شود اشتها شود وقتی که سوسمار صفت پیش آفتاب یک رنگها شود و رنگها شود وقتی که دامان شرف و نطفه‌گیر شرم رجال خیز گردد و پتیار زا شود بگذار در بزرگی این منجلاب یأس دنیای من به کوچکی انزوا شود. When silver rules, when gold is God, when the lie is the measure of all events, when the air we breathe and live becomes a lid suffocating hundreds of voices, when we wag our tails in frenzy waiting for a bone, when the smell of food from a neighbor's table makes your mind and brain lose control and change into a stomach, when under the sun men of reptilian constitution change colors again and again, when the womb of honor gives birth only to prostitutes and coarse men. In this enormous cesspool of despair, let my world shrink to the point of seclusion. Published in 1973, this poem depicts a political climate so corrupt and so mistrustful that even the most basic biological functions are inverted and distorted. In this poem, the shrinkage of the speaker's world into, quote, the seclusion in the poem's final couplet, an individual tormented human body, its brain under extreme starvation, its airways stifled by censorship, stands in contrast to the enormous cesspool of despair that suffocates hundreds of voices. Injustice, the ghazal suggests, by alternating between singular and plural form within and across couplets, affects both the individual and the community in a cyclical, destructive pattern. Behbahani's dystopia is bred of a seemingly unilateral, ubiquitous violence that breeds many destructive dualities as well. And in this surrealist landscape, the brain, quote, changes into a stomach. The womb of honor mutates the typical mother-child binary as it gives birth to fully grown, sexually active women and physically violent men. As in many of Behbahani's poems, a powerful questioning of gender norms in this poem is integral to capturing its historical moment of simmering political protest. The voice in Donyai Kuchikeman is not gender-marked, and it becomes explicitly collective as a result of communal suffocation. Farzaneh has written that gender depolarization is crucial to Behbahani's ghazal renovations. Quote, by desegregating this predominantly masculine form of literature, Behbahani has democratized the ghazal to an unprecedented scale. Through her work, women could now be the producers as well as the consumers of this literary genre. They can be its authors as well as its objects. Just as Behbahani subverts gender norms throughout the poem, reptilian men change colors and the womb of honor refuses typical female biological function, so she refuses to employ the ghazal's final couplet in its traditional mode as envoi from implicitly male poet to either god or implicitly female beloved. Since standard Persian syntax, of course, requires the verb to be placed at the end of the sentence, the restriction of the radif, the end rhyme, has a slightly different effect than it does on the ghazal in English, because it leads to the freezing of action and a cyclical return to the same verb throughout the poem. But Behbahani's radif in this poem is shavad, becomes. And in choosing the verb of change as an ironic constant, she fixes the poem into this perpetual becoming. In most of these couplets, Behbahani uses repetition not only at the end, but at the beginning, with the repetition of vakti, when. Perhaps a pre-revolutionary gesture as the poet anticipates the upheaval to come. There is the incantatory rhythm of a storyteller in that repeated opening word, a trace of yekibud yekinabud, that is reminiscent of the ultimate female storyteller in Middle Eastern literature, the enchanting and ingenious Scheherazade, whose stories spoke truth to power, and who each night saved the life of her sister and herself. In fact, the ghazal form itself echoes the structure of the 1001 Nights. Each story Scheherazade tells, night by night, has its own self-contained plot, just like each couplet has its own striking imagery. But at the same time, the open-endedness of each story in the epic, and in each couplet in the ghazal, makes it part of a larger frame narrative, a hypothetically endless story of survival through brave and clever storytelling, which can always be expanded to accommodate more voices. And I think this is very true of Behbahani's ghazals as well. While the standalone couplets in this ghazal speak of individual horrors, they're framed by this formal guiding hand of Behbahani's storyteller-speaker, whose turn from present into future tense opens up possibilities for political empowerment. After doing the activist's work of exposing and vilifying the social and political corruption around her, the poem's speaker retreats into seclusion in the last couplet, so that same work becomes necessarily twofold, its burdens and rewards passed on to its audience for political action. When Adrienne Rich became the first ever person to turn down the National Medal of Arts in 1997, she explained in a letter addressed to the National Endowment for the Arts and to President Clinton, quote, the very meaning of art, as I understand it, is incompatible with the cynical politics of this administration. There is no simple formula for the relationship of art to justice, but I do know that art, in my own case the art of poetry, means nothing if it simply decorates the dinner table of power which holds it hostage. And it is precisely that relationship of art to justice, this bridge between the artist and the public, between poetic and political language, between those who set the standards of cultural hegemony and those who suffer from them, for which both Rich and Behbahani's work became known. The moment of simultaneously intimate and global suspension between possibility and change is the quintessence of the ghazal for Rich, as it is for Behbahani, for which the ghazal is performative, contingent, and ephemeral, sometimes cryptic, but with a prismatic range. In all these qualities, it finds an openness that transforms it into a worlding vehicle, steered through the world by each reader it encounters, not codified by nation, language, or culture. The form itself provides a cultural bridge. As Rich wrote in one ghazal, "When they read this poem of mine, they are translators. Every existence speaks a language of its own." Written in 2009, the contemporary, the Behbahani ghazal "Digar Savar Nakham Shod," which Kaveh read, his translation of, confronted a very different political climate than early ghazals such as Dunyai Ko Chikeman. After decades of seeing the country change under various phases of the Islamic Republic's development and leadership. And in couplets such as this one, the poet reaffirms the importance of the voice that can both stand up for itself and speak for a larger cause of social justice. من زنده ام به سخن گفتن جوش و خروش و برا شفتن از سنگ و صخره نیاندیشم سیلم مهار نخواهم شد.
ز گهواره تا گور زور است و زور خداوند زورا در افتی به گور. به نفرین چرا باید آغاز کرد به اشک از چه داری دو چشم نمور. هنر نیست نفرین نامردمان تو در موی ایشان به جشن و سرور. پی گور خود رفت چابک سوار بدان دخمه بردش پی خیش گور. به سیمین بگو ای که نامت بلند که همتای خیشی یا از خیش دور. گشودی سخن را در بسته ای ز خورشید گفتی و از موش کور. ز گورت کشیدند گوری دگر چنان مرده دزد و چنان مرده شور. که این گوربانان ز مرگ آمدند به مرگند زنده به مرگند جور. چه رنجی و نالی و سوزی به درد مرنج و مسوز و منال و مشور. خدای سخن را مگر گور بود از این بی‌هنر لشکر سلم و تور. مگر قرة العین در چاه نیست که باز آیدش چه چه از چاه دور. شبی مرگبار است پر تند رخش نه پیداست سوگ و نه پیداست سور. سفید از چشم شب روسیاه پدر دشنه زد در جگرگاه پور. یکی بت شکستند و خود بت شدند تن از تب بسوزاندم چون تنور. که گور جوانان برآورده اند چه آهو به دام و چه ماهی به تور. نگفتند موری که دانه کش است نگفتند آیا میازار مور. گذشتن که مردم بخوانی رمه گذشتن که مردم ببینی سطور. چنین است انجام آن خواب خوش که شب گربه آمد به چشمان سمور. چه نالی که گیتی چنین هم نماند خرد آمداری و بشکست زور. ز خون سیاوش برآمد نهال که گر سیرازش کشت و تیغ دمور. ندیدند یاران و کی میرسد که پرده براندازد از خویش هور. چه شیرین سرودی شود روز تلخ چه شوری در افتد در آوای شور. به هر گوشه آوازه‌ای سر دهند بخوانند چامه به زخم چگور. که سیمین به زر نام خود برنوشت بهشت سخن را نه بر سنگ گور. ممنونم.
تا گفت هست میان دارم اهل کنار نخواهم شد. یک دشت شعر و سخن دارم حال از هوای وطن دارم. یک دشت شعر و سخن دارم حال از هوای وطن دارم. چابک غزال غزل هستم آسان شکار نخواهم شد. من آن زنم که به نامردی سوی حصار نخواهم شد. برغم که بعد درخشیدن از من زندم به سخن گفتن، جوش و خروش و برآشفتن. من زندم به سخن گفتن، جوش و خروش و برآشفتن. از سنگ و صخره نپرهیزم، سیلم مهار نخواهم شد. من آن زنم که به نامردی سوی حصار نخواهم شد. گفتم از آن چه که بادا